everyone. We're moving on to Chapter 7 of The Secret Team by General Fletcher Prouty, and we're on page 187. So we've read quite a bit. We're almost halfway through. Today we'll be reading Chapter 7. From the pines of Maine to the birches of Russia, the nature of clandestine operations. A light plane skimmed the treetops of the dense hardwood forest of northern Maine. It dipped from view and was gone. To anyone who might have been watching, the lake where the plane landed was too small for any pontoon equipment plane. However, the landing was safe and the plane taxied toward two men sitting in a small inflated boat. One of them had been winding the hand crank of a small generator. The other was tuning a transceiver as the plane approached. The pilot cut the throttle and the men paddled to the nearest float and climbed aboard. The pilot reported that he had picked up the homing beacon several times at distance of from 30 to 60 miles. He could have gotten more range, but the flight plan called for a low altitude flight. So he had to do the best he could from the treetop height. The beacon, newly modified to give a stronger signal, satisfied them. Further testing would take place at Norfolk. The men stowed the gear aboard the plane and deflated the raft. The co-pilot, who spoke no English, helped them up. The pilot restarted the engine and gunned the throttle to take them to the far side of the pond. With everything ready for takeoff, and the plane heavy with 4 men aboard, the pilot waited for a slight breeze, which would put ripples on the water and help them get off more quickly. A technician could have noted that large leading edge slats on this plane were extended before takeoff and that the large trailing flaps were also down for maximum lift. With the breeze, some steady ripples of a full throttle, the pilot let the plane accelerate for about 12 seconds and then lifted it clear. Once off the water, he began an easy spiral climb to get up and out of the tree-lined valley. A month of special training had paid off. The new Helio Courier had proven itself to be the best and most rugged short-field plane available. The floats were not too busy and the plane handled well on the water. Most important, the new co-pilot had transitioned quickly and had handled the plane like an old pro. He needed more instrument work for weather flying, and he needed some navigational experience. He would get that training at Norfolk. He had liked flying in Maine, and he reported that it looked like my homeland. After a short hop, the plane landed in Moosehead Lake, and everyone went back to Greenville to prepare to close the camp. In Germany, hundreds of thousands of displaced persons and repatriated refugees had been interrogated and debriefed as they came through the military processing centers. A small fraction of this horde of people, fleeing the communists and the reprisals of their own countrymen, possessed information that was useful intelligence. This select group was turned over to professional interrogators who worked for military intelligence and the CIA. Only the very best were reserved for CIA questioning, and these were screened carefully to assure accuracy, integrity, and to the spot of an inevitable planted agent. Among the group, the agency had found several who had given evidence of military buildup by the early 1950s. Of a very special nature far north of Moscow, this intelligence had been screened, evaluated, and analyzed to see what it meant. About the best that the refugees and defectors could provide was the new interceptor fighter bases were being built farther north than ever seen before, and a vast array of radars indicating the development of a sophisticated air defense network was being installed. One day, a young Polish defector who claimed to have been a pilot turned himself in, and after careful screening and background checking, he was brought to the safe house not far from the IG Farben building in Frankfurt for further interrogation. They killed him. Just saying. In the course of this work, he said that he had made several trips as a co-pilot delivering cargo to the new construction sites as these fighter bases in the Soviet Northwest. As if to prove his point, he said he could find his way back there anytime. Clandestine operations take form through such small and unexpected leads. The agent who had been working with this pilot was not in the Directorate of Intelligence side. He was a member of the Central European Staff of DD/P, the Special Operations Staff of the agency. Up to the time of that last statement, he had been interested only in secret intelligence project designed to obtain all the information he could get on Soviet air defenses. That evening, when he stopped at the Officers Club in Frankfurt, he met a few other agents who were visiting from Washington. He mentioned the chance remark of the Polish pilot. A few months earlier, there had been a meeting in the Pentagon and in the Air Force plans offices where the vast air resupply and communications program was managed. These special Air Force units called ARC wings were stationed in strategic locations all over the world, including among their special classified missions was the task of providing wartime support of the CIA. Several CIA men attended the meeting in the Pentagon, and when it broke up, one of them stayed behind to ask the Air Force pilots what they thought was the best light plane for rugged special operations type business. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead in the future where I'm going to go to a signing where I request to speak with the CIA agents, and then me and the CIA agents are going to chill and hang out and laugh because I know them, which is a big joke. One of the officers reported that a small company consisting for the most part of ex-Massachusetts Institute of Technology aeronautical engineering men was building and flying a plane called the Helio Courier. If it was really as good as it was reported to be, it might be the plane the CIA wanted. Oh, you're going to buy me coffee? Well, that's so nice of you. I love it. Cool. Where are we going to go? Yeah, I've kind of had enough around here too. I've already done 80 videos. They're all watching anyway, so what's the big fucking deal? About 1 week later, a man reported to the Helio Aircraft Corporation in Norwood, Massachusetts to learn more about this plane. Do you mind? He's laughing. What else? He gave his true name, showed the identification of a U.S. Air Force civilian employee, and said he worked in the Air Force headquarters. He spent several days with the Helio company and returned with an enthusiastic report. He actually worked for the air division of the DDP in the CIA, and his boss at the time was an Air Force colonel on duty with the CIA. I wonder what colonel that would be. I have to interrupt again and say to Colonel Prouty, I find it interesting that he never calls himself out. He never really calls himself out because he's worked for this for 31 years and he was leads in a lot of areas and he knows a lot about a lot, but he never really says if he was piloting the plane, whether he was carrying cargo or anything else, which is fine, but I'm just saying I think it's humorous. But I don't blame him because when he wrote this book, he was still alive, so he had some time left. It's just funny. He's such a brilliant author, man. These documents are very, 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 very smart. You're very smart. After proper testing and evaluation, the CIA decided to purchase several of these aircraft. However, the Air Force had none of these planes, and the plane could not be purchased by the Air Force for the CIA because it could not be covered unless there were others like it in the Air Force. The CIA decided to buy these planes anyway and set up a civilian cover unit for them, putting them under commercial coverage. At the same time, the agent in Frankfurt was talking with a Polish pilot. These same aircraft had just been delivered to the CIA and were being shaken down for special operations work. This had happened quite by chance that this agent told his friends in Germany that the CIA had just the plane that could make the flight if they could get the Polish pilot sufficiently trained for it and if they could get the operation approved through the old man, which, just to let you know, he speaks differently than most of you speak. So a lot of you won't understand what he's saying unless I explain it to you or read it to you in a way that you'll understand because his brain was evolved and your brain is the reverse, and not as a judgment, but as an awareness game of where we're headed as a societal norm. They knew Air Division would back them. It wanted more action than border flying and training exercises. They counted on the approval of Richard Helms and Frank Wisner. Both men at that time were DDP. Wisner was a chief and felt sure General Cable could go along with the idea, since Air Force could use any information it could get about the Russian air defenses to support the growing B-52 strategic bomber flight budget. Also being said is intelligent people have different views of intelligence. Does that make sense? They knew the ultimate decision would be up to the Alan Dulles. Fucking hate that guy. Do you see how much control they gave this dude? It's like, damn. You know what? I feel like he wrote this book because he couldn't stand Alan. It's like true. Like, God, I think I'll risk my life to tell y'all how much I can't stand this dude. During the next weeks, the agent in Frankfurt worked very hard with a young Pole to see how much he knew, whether he really knew the Soviet Union and whether he really could fly an airplane. Everything seemed to work out. The information the Pole gave him checked out with everything the Frank... Will you stop? Lay down. Leave her alone. Gave him checked out with everything the Frankfurt station could get. With this underway, the Frankfurt station agent kept a friend in Washington informed of all developments. Between them, they kept feeding business messages designed to heat up the subject of new Soviet air defenses. Nope. Intelligence channels. Everything possible was done to increase intelligence communications traffic on this subject. The U.S. Air Force Intelligence Office of U.S. Air Force's Europe headquarters in Wiesbaden was put on the task. It quite willingly picked up the ball because that headquarters had a very active border flying activity and was giving them something to do besides dropping leaflets and furnishing tens of thousands of weather balloons. USAFE increases traffic on this subject to the Air Force, the U.S. Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, and to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha. At the same time, the Frankfurt station agent arranged to have the Air Force Group and the Wiesbaden Air Base set up a light plane flight reorientation course for the Polish pilot. An Air Force light plane was made available, and the relief of everyone, the Pole proved to be a good pilot. It was easier to get him through the refresher course than it had been to get the plane for him. If the mission were to operate into the Soviet Union, the pilot was never know who was supporting him. Therefore, he was told that a German air operator had a Polish pilot and a plane, and that they would give him some refresher flying so that they could seek employment. He was never told that he was being prepared to fly the Soviet Union. The Air Force plane was put into the hangar and stripped of all USAF identity. Then German instrument decals were put in the cockpit, and Polish pilot, one whom the agency had ready at the special billet in Greece, and transferred to the Frankfurt station. Every day the Polish defector would be given to the airfield for his lesson. The older CIA stateless pilot not only gave him transition flying, but tried in every way to test the newer man and to break his story, but the facts held up, and the young pilot proved to be sincere and reliable. With this success, the idea of the project had begun to take shape. Air Division plotted several flight plans from a secret location in Norway into the Soviet Union because the courier performed so well on water, and a water landing at an unknown destination seemed to offer the most chance for success. It had been decided to operate from a water departure point to a water destination. Also, each flight plan called for a low, under-radar canopy, treetop level pattern. Long-range, low-level navigation is difficult because visibility pilot age purposes is reduced to a narrow track. This was a doubly true for this flight because any radio aid that might exist was limited and hostile. Border electronic information flights had pinpointed some radio fixes that could be used, but even at best, these were quite unreliable. A Loran navigation fix would be ideal, but none was in operation that far north. This was overcome by having the U.S. Navy agree to put Loran carrying ship in the far north as part of the NATO exercise. I'm sorry, I was in thought. This would give a good, reliable, and secret navigational and code signal system for most of the flight. The mission plane would not be required to make any transmissions in order to use Loran for navigational purposes. It would simply receive the signals it needed. Meanwhile, Air Division did not wish to pin all of its hopes on the young Pole. He would fly the plane, but an agent would be trained to help him navigate and serve as a helper for the two-man team that would be infiltrated into Russia. A series of long-range navigation missions was set up and all the systems thoroughly tested. By this time, DDP had accepted the proposal and had become its sponsor. The U.S. Air Force and Navy had been fully sounded out, and they went along with the idea. At that point, a meeting was set up at the OCD, often to soften up any possible opposition and to prepare for the crucial vote of the Secretary of Defense in the NSC Special Group meeting. Since the operation would have a vital military intelligence tie-in and the OCSD vote was just about assured, this was the period of the Allen W. Dulles, John Foster Dulles partnership. So no meeting was scheduled at the Department of State. The old man will handle that. Was sufficient to assure that the vote of the NSC. With all this preparation, it was no problem for DDP. Wisner to sell the idea to General Cabell the way we cleared for the meeting with Allen Dulles. The agent from the Frankfurt station flew into Washington on a deep-water flight, a clandestine flight with a cover flight and no customs intervention on a CIA-owned U.S. Air Force C-118 transport with the Polish pilot as a passenger. The Pole was kept at a safe house near Andrews Air Force Base, just a few miles from Dulles. The Frankfurt station's agent attended the meeting with Dulles, as did General Cabell, Wisner, and a few others. The idea was accepted by Mr. Dulles, and he asked his executive to put it on the agenda for the next special group meeting. That evening, before his usual tennis game on this backyard court, Allen Dulles dropped by his brother's secluded house just off Massachusetts Avenue and discussed the operation with him. Foster agreed that Eisenhower would go along with it. He walked over to the wall lined with bookshelves and picked up the special white telephone that connected directly with the White House operator. All he said was, "Is the man busy?" Foster Dulles opened with, "Boss, how do you do a burning tree today?" "Well, 6 holes is better than nothing. Yes, I've been talking here with Allen. He has a proposal he wants to clear with you. He feels it is very important and will lift the morale of Frank's boys. You know, since Korea and Guatemala, you haven't had them doing much. Will you see him tomorrow morning?" "Fine. How's Mammy?" "Okay, boss. I'll speak to Allen at 9:30. Thank you. Good night." There was not much left to do. The flight would be scheduled. First, a Polish pilot was given a briefing on this cover story. He was being employed by a foreign company to do some bush flying, and he would get some training with one of their men in the United States. The company man was the CIA agent with Air Division. He would be the mission commander shortly after his first meeting. They were flown to Maine, where they met the pilot, also an agency employee of the courier. The plane had a cover company name on it and a special FAA registry number, which would never show in official FAA records if it were to be challenged. The flight indoctrination concentrated on float techniques, short field landing and takeoff, and low-level, low-range navigation. The agency mission commander had been trained to take the Loran fixes for navigation. When the pilot had passed all his flying tests, he was introduced to the 2-man stay-behind team. These men would be infiltrated on one flight and then recovered on another. These passengers went by their business by themselves and were always except on the flights accompanied by a case officer. It seemed that they did not speak English, and they made no attempt to speak it to the Polish pilot. If this mission failed and they were and any of them were interrogated, they would know nothing about one another. In Norfolk, the final phase of training took place. A secluded cove near the mouth of the York River on Chesapeake Bay had a very small section roped off to simulate this tiny landing area they expected to find in Russia as targeted of this infiltration mission. I've been there, I think, maybe. Day after day, the pilot practiced from that tree-bordered cove so that he would be instinctively used by flying that way. Short takeoff and landing. Flying is a real high-order skill, and he needed all the training he could get. The next thing he needed was long-range navigation experience, much of it over water and out of sight of land. Flight plans, as much as possible, like the one he would fly from Norway into Russia, were set up. He flew these at extended range day after day until he could hit the target accurately. The agency man helped him with Loran navigation and taught him how to fly in such a manner that he would conserve his fuel. On the real flight, he would have it to get in and out of Russia without refueling, and he would have very little reserve. The next step was to ask the Frankfurt Station liaison officer, who had contact with the British intelligence service, to set up a meeting somewhere in England for the Polish pilot and a very reliable high-level Russian defector who was being debriefed secretly at that time. The British agreed to the meeting and suggested it be held at the CIA subbase near the U.S. Air Force Base of the Air Resupply and Communications Wing stationed in England. Thus, the meeting would be very secret and could be covered adequately by the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Air Force. Finally, everything was ready. The courier was left at Norfolk because another new plane had been built by this one with absolutely no identification markings of any kind, no paint, no decals, or no serial numbers. Even the tires, battery, radio parts, etc. were either stripped clean or they had been purchased from various foreign sources. If this plane were lost in Russia, no matter what the Russians might try to charge, this government would not say nothing at all, and if pressed, would deny everything. Are you kidding me? The plane had been totally sanitized from the start. The new plane had its wings removed and was placed aboard a U.S. Air Force transport plane. All the mission personnel were placed aboard the same plane and flown from Andrews Field on the Black flight to England. There at the same base where the pilot had first met the Soviet defector, and final briefing was held. At this time, the pilot was told that he was really going to do. He agreed to go ahead and was briefed by the Russian along with the agency personnel. Later, the same Russian briefed the two passengers separately. They knew what to do. A few days later, the whole team was flown to the airfield in northern Norway. The Oslo CIA station chief had cleared the operation with the contact man in the Norwegian government. He was told about the flight and even only a cover story about the real reason for it. Foster Dulles had told the American ambassador as little as possible. He had simply been informed if by some chance any of the stateless personnel were compromised by a takeoff crash or other incident, the ambassador would be prepared to act. Otherwise, he had no role to play. The mission commander led the whole team through the entire exercise on several dry runs until they all knew their roles perfectly. The U.S. Navy, British Navy, and a Norwegian ship or two were participating in a NATO northern exercise. Fleets of transport aircraft flew from various northern bases back and forth over the Arctic, making obvious use of the Loran network. All was in readiness. Border reconnaissance flights were intensified out of Athens and Wiesbaden. RB-47 high-altitude flights were stepped up off Murmansk, Murmansk. Then, with a report of good weather and clear skies, the courier left Norway from its 4 occupants and secret equipment. 4 hours, the plane skimmed the waves, staying below radar surveillance. U.S. Alert monitors listened for increased alert level activities. All were silent. Suddenly, in the Loran carrier wave, a final all-clear signal was given. It was a simple code flashed in microseconds and unintelligible to all those the most sophisticated equipment. Then the courier turned to the southeast and toward landfall. The barren coastline rose quickly. A heavy, dark forest grew right into the sea. The horizon was low and rolling as the plane sped on its way. Although the plane lands at a very slow speed, it cruises at a relatively high speed even with floats. Just as dawn broke gray and heavy, they neared the destination. The only identifiable landmark they had passed was a single-track railroad cutting a long, straight furrow through the forest. After the railroad, there was a stream that led to the pond where they would land. The pilot made only the slightest half-turn pattern, cut the power, dropped full flaps, and slipped over some pine trees and landed with an easy splash. They were down. The Maine short landing techniques had paid off. With the engine off, they paddled the plane to the shore where they hastily concealed it with netting and evergreen branches. They stayed behind. Team uploaded all of its gear and moved well into the woods. The pilot and the mission commander slept. Later in the twilight of the brief northern day, the crew waved to the man on shore, and the courier flashed across the pond over the trees and away from the darkness. An hour after crossing the coastline, the MC flashed a simple signal on the carrier wave. Right away, a welcome flash came back on Loran and an all-clear radio signal, which meant destination weather was all right. A few hours later, the plane landed in Norway. The training had paid off. 10 days later, and stay behind team was recovered. This time they all helped the pilot by using the hand crank generator to put out a signal to guide him to the pond. All 4 men returned to the base in Norway. The MC was debriefed in England and certain British agents present. Then he flew back to Washington. The 2 infiltrated team men were not seen again with anyone of the early group, and the young Pole was transferred to his new civilian job in Athens. An instrument team made their secret intelligence report to the appropriate staff sections of DDI in the old CIA buildings near the reflecting pool beside the mall in Washington. Their report was properly evaluated, analyzed, and disseminated to the military. They had heard AURALLY and electronically much fighter aircraft traffic and had picked up radar signals, which they had recorded. This team had the MC receive silently the highest award the CIA can give. In the profession, the fact of the awkward was known, but elsewhere, even the awkward itself was a classified subject. Awkward! Over and over again. Awkward! Over and over again. Self-awareness is key. Meanwhile, certain very closed and selected meetings were being held in the agency's inner sanctum in a nondescript office building in the H Street NW area of downtown Washington. Designated need-to-know staff members from the CIA, the White House, Defense State, the NSA, and the AEC. Had a number of sessions with the men who had been in the USSR. Their report was of great value. This whole fighter-based radar defense operation was real, but it was itself all part of another layer of cover story. These 2 men of the Stay Behind team had recorded a Soviet story. These 2 men of the Stay Behind team had recorded a Soviet nuclear explosion. They had, by unexpectedly lucky timing, actually witnessed the faraway glow of that tremendous explosion, and they had left the Russia very sensitive earth-sounding sensors, which would give limited but valuable signals whenever they were activated by further Soviet nuclear tests. As in the case of another CIA undercover missions, most of what was known, even by those who knew a plane had been flown into and back from Russia, was a cover story. State and defense had benefited from the air defense intelligence. The real story of all the facts were reserved for the inner team of the CIA and for their co-workers, secreted through the government. This flight into Russia was for them simply a step into the road to Indonesia, to Cuba, to Tibet, and ultimately to Vietnam. This had been a well-rehearsed and well-developed small operation in the style and manner of true covert intelligence work. When the leaders of the U.S. government use such operations for positive purposes, they may be expected to do some good. When they are repeated too frequently, when they grow too large, and when they are poorly developed and directed, They are harmful and they destroy any good that might ever come from them. That is the first part of chapter 7. From the pines of Maine to the birches of Russia. The nature of clandestine operations.